I think somebody to really answer this question, there would have to be a very knowledgeable scholar on the history, which I can't say that I have the detailed type of knowledge of every single progressive ethnic cleansing that happened. I just know that they happened and that they're written in the historical books like the Raja Tarangani and Shona Leka Kaul. I've read her book and I've relied upon her book because she's studied the Sanskrit from the primary sources. So I know that scholars who are greater than me have researched this, and they've affirmed that this has occurred, and it's not only in the records of the Hindus, it's in the records of these colonizers as well. So how is it possible for two realities to coincide in such a way that the negative aspects of history are swept aside and the positive are promoted? Because if you look at it in a sort of conceptual sense, you had punctuations of brutality that happened. So like 1990, if you can just reimagine that happened, that didn't happen overnight, that happened progressively ever since even the 30s. I've found some news clippings and so forth of agitations and that, you know, Hindus had been attacked because of an alleged blasphemy committed by someone else, but because that police person was a Hindu, they went and took it out on everyone. And you know, there's two particular incidents in 1931 and 1932. So you see that it slowly, incrementally builds up, and these cycles of violence, you know, they seem to be sudden when they start, like this loudspeakers blasting, and you know, these threats that are being printed on, you know, in your ordinary media that people read and people have access to. It's not like they're just necessarily throwing leaflets around that they've printed in their you know, their little terrorist hideouts. These are things that were known, and they happened in broad daylight, you know, in the public eye, and everybody knew about it. That's why everybody fled, because there were these selective killings, and then there were all these threats being made, and it generated an atmosphere of terror among the entire community, which is what it was meant to do. So, you know, just horrific killings. And of course, they wanted you to know that this is what we're going to do to all of you unless you convert, leave, or die. So if you think about it in that sense, they had periods of punctuated intense violence where people were ethnically cleansed, pushed out, and then you had periods of more stability and social cohesion when they were invited back. So that happened over time. And are we going to let these cycles, I mean, when are people going to learn to look at these cycles as a pattern and start thinking, okay, you know, it might look okay on the surface, people might be getting along, they might be doing business together in their shops, they might be going to school together, they might be sharing food from their fruit trees together, or, you know, conducting even, you know, religious ceremonies together. They might be doing that, right? And then all of a sudden, radicalization comes in, and all of a sudden, overnight, everything changes. So it's just a pattern that's been continued, and it's happened over and over and over again. And it's because of radicalized, you know, very fundamentalist notions that say that Hindus, you know, they're outsiders, they're the others. They don't fit in. So on one hand, they say, okay, well, we're Indigenous, and this is an Indigenous sovereignty movement. And on the other hand, the people that they descended from to make them Indigenous are no longer welcome in the valley. It's just layered contradictions. So you've got stories that are being told to smooth things over and make everything okay, to keep the harmony. But to do that, you have to forget. Forgive and forget, forgive and forget. I mean, how many times do you want to forgive and forget until these people actually stop?
You mentioned in your paper about both Kashmir and Australian example of Abrahamic colonization, which centered around the authority of religious institutions to inflict violence on the target population. And we have seen this in Kashmir as well during the 90s when we see a population of 160,000 to 170,000 Pandits living in the valley, and only 4,000 to 5,000 remain right now. We've also seen around 208 temples that were damaged, desecrated in the last 2 decades. A simple question would have been, when you're talking about the very narrative that was being propagated about Kashmiri, where was Kashmir at that time, and how your neighbors who were sharing food, as you're mentioning, what happened to them? Why did they turn their back towards the Kashmiri Pandits? Because if the majoritarian population, or the majority of the population wanted peace, why would a minority population have to flee?
Well, this we're talking about that these systems and structures of institutionalized violence. And I mean, if you understand violence can be sporadic, but it also is a structure, it's a system. So it requires people who will commit the acts, people who allow those acts to be committed and who do not do or say anything. And then you have the people upon whom those acts are committed. And we know that the acts of violence that have been committed in Kashmir are not limited to just Hindus. The violence that's been committed against people is all to do with whether or not they're on their side or they're perceived to be not on their side. So if you're perceived to be supportive of the Indian government, for example, if you're perceived to be a foreigner, if you're perceived to be an outsider, if you're perceived to be XYZ, you know, Hindutva, Bhakt, any of these words, supporting the Modi government and so forth. We saw that in December, that people were using words like that, the terrorists were using words like that. So it doesn't really matter in that sense. You're not safe, even if you are a Muslim, but also when it comes to radical, you know, Wahhabism and Salafism and Deobandism and so forth, when that washes through a community, those people who do not take up those very strict expressions, manifestations of Islam, they're also targeted. So the whole community is being coercively controlled through violence and threats. So how did they turn? I mean, if you look at it on two levels, you can say, okay, well, they had to align themselves. If you look at this present situation, India has stayed neutral in the situation of Russia and Ukraine. You can see the pressure that has come on India from other countries to take a side. If you just isolate that down and put it into a community perspective, these people were being terrorized, you know, and whether or not they actually did you know, believe, I'm not willing to make that call, because I've seen a small minority, a very small minority of people who are Kashmiri Muslims have actually stood up and said, this is wrong. And those are the people that need to be brought out, because they're the people that are willing to stand on the right side of history, no matter the fact that their own community were involved in this. And then you've got the enablers, who are the ones that are saying nothing, or even supporting or even glorifying, going out onto the street to glorify and martyr people, terrorists. These are the types of enablers that actually either directly, overtly support terrorism, or who tacitly support it by doing and saying nothing, by not reporting it to the authorities, for example. And letting these, you know, absolute sociopathic control freaks get away with what they're doing. And we're not in that stage yet. Like, Australia was colonised by British imperialists. So you had your different levels of, you know, you had your convicts, you had your free settlers, you had your officers, you had, you know, your members of the official government and so forth. And then later on, they came out with their missionaries, and the missionaries worked hand in glove with the authorities to keep the Indigenous peoples under control. So they had, on one side, they had brutal genocidal violence being inflicted on the community, the Indigenous community, absolutely brutal genocidal violence. And on the other hand, you had these people going in and taking their children, right, and putting them in missions and teaching them later on. They would be like, oh, we've got to bring you and assimilate you and convert you into our culture. So it's a very similar kind of methodology. You've got, you know, either convert, you've got your good cop, which is the benevolent savior that says, look, if you just convert, then you can live. we'll even protect you if you can convert. Like, you can become a member of, for example, you can become a British subject and we'll look after you. But if you don't convert, you know, either tacitly or overtly, we'll hunt you down and kill you. That's the theory. And I mean, that's the method of what they've been doing. Abrahamic supremacists who think themselves to be the chosen ones, who think themselves to be the civilization that should have dominion over the earth, who are, you know, this is rightfully theirs, this entire planet is rightfully theirs. This is a type of absolutely narcissistic and sociopathic selfishness of these traditions that needs to be rooted out now, because we can't be getting lectured to about liberalism and egalitarianism by people that have a history like this and who haven't changed. They haven't actually, you know, maybe on the outside, there's the more tolerant and liberal Abrahamics, but have they stood up and said, we want to stop this conversion of Indigenous people that's happening all around the world. We want to stop this indigenocide, this cultural genocide, this ecocide. We want to stop controlling women's reproduction and so forth, so that they bring forward the new, you know, civilized species and race. Like, do they ever do that? We never hear it from them. So in a way, they're the silent ones, and they're complicit because they're not talking about it. They're not stopping it. So this is how it happens. I mean, it happened in the church. Little girls, you know, who were abused by the priest would tell their parents, and their parents themselves would turn against them. That's how violence works. That's how it stays alive. That's how systems of violence are institutionalized.
Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. धन्यवाद, नमस्कार.